tagline for the Milestone launch back in 1993 was, "If you're not there, you just won't get it."
It was almost like all of these creators were siphoning my childhood.
These were not images that we were seeing in the media at that time.
Milestone was created to be the voice of a group that was underserved, that was underrepresented in comics, and there were a lot of great African-American artists in comics at that time. I think they were bursting to tell their own stories and not be Luke Cage saying "Sweet Christmas."
Change never comes easy in the comics business. That's exactly what happened in 1993 when four gentlemen, Michael Davis, Derek Dingle, Dwayne McDuffie, and Dennis Cowan, launched Milestone Comics. If there is one word to describe Milestone Comics, it's impact. The imprint that launched in 1993 upended the industry. The original quartet of books that launched Milestone were more than just new comics. They did more than just introduce cool characters like Static and Hardware, who have excelled and endured for nearly 3 decades. Milestone Comics paved the way for other new heroes that better reflected the diverse nature of the world around us. Heroes like Miles Morales, Kamala Khan, Riri Williams, Duke Thomas. These are some of the most notable new characters introduced in comics in the past decade. And you can make a strong argument that none would exist if Milestone hadn't kicked down the doors it did. Let's go behind the panel with Milestone Comics.
Up until that point, especially among the big two, Marvel and DC, the Luke Cages, the Black Panthers, there may be facets of the Black experience that were touched on, but you felt that you weren't getting a full story.
Dennis Cowan and Derek Dingle were childhood friends who had taken different career paths. Dingle worked in magazines like Black Enterprise and Money Magazine. Cowan had established a rep as one of the top artists at DC and Marvel on books like The Question and Deathlock. Michael Davis, another one of the founders, was an artist and writer. The final piece of the puzzle was Dwayne McDuffie, a comics writer and editor who had done the Damage Control miniseries and worked on several other books at Marvel. The Milestone founders knew there was an audience waiting for heroes they could identify with and saw an opportunity.
At that point, there were a few characters of color, more on the Marvel side than DC. But since I knew the Milestone guys, it was interesting just sort of watching them create this whole crop of characters from the ground up.
Dwayne, I distinctly remember talking to him on the phone and him saying, well, I've been thinking about it, and there's really 2 archetypes, maybe 3. Batman, Superman, maybe Spider-Man, because he's a teenager and just learning. And so he said, I think I want a teenage hero, I want an angry guy doing the gadgety Batman stuff, and we need a team book, and that should be a gang. Which was really, I think, one of the most purely brilliant things about Milestone, Blood Syndicate, and it was also one of the things that I think a lot of people found off-putting.
The big problem for anyone growing up reading comics at that time is that you felt the characters that existed in Marvel and DC were monoliths, and they had to stand for everything that the Black experience encaptured. Milestone gave you a nice, broad view of the entire Black experience.
And all these characters were just interesting in terms of how they were just designed and drawn. In the 90s, you had a lot of sort of bad new books that started. A lot of really cheesy universes, but the fact that the Milestone Dakota universe started because the police and I think the mayor's office had lured all of the gangbangers in the city into Central Park, and the idea was to sort of nuke them with like a chemical agent, which was just like, whoa, and that just created a bunch of superpowered hoods, or even people who were just happening to be walking by got superpowers. I thought that was like a brilliant premise to kick off the whole Dakota Milestone universe.
One thing that helped Milestone stand apart from the other comic book companies of the day was the attention paid to details. This is the legendary Milestone Bible, the backbone of the Dakota universe. It includes extensive details on each original character. In other words, it's a one-stop shop for launching a comic book universe.
The very first document is what was the part of the presentation at DC. I wrote it with Dwayne, although I'm the guy that actually was sitting at the typewriter. Subsequently, there was an expanded document that was the official Bible of the Milestone universe. Dwayne McDuffie wrote that Bible, and he greatly expanded on the platform that the 5 of us had originally created, and just took it to a whole nother level.
It was fairly detailed, and we stuck to probably 70–80% of it. Ivan Velez Jr. created so many memorable characters for Blood Syndicate that weren't in the first Bible. There was an expanded Bible that had characters like Quai and Dog, which were his Blood Syndicate characters.
We're talking a document detailing every corner of the Milestone universe, going into it. Interestingly enough, Icon was originally supposed to be named Paragon, but I do believe they couldn't get clearance for the name, which is why they finally went with Icon going forward. But everything in terms of history and voting patterns, ideology, and dynamic between the characters, Icon was fleshed out. Hardware was completely fleshed out from top to bottom.
I remember when I was working as an editor at Disney Adventures way back in the day, and my boss, Marv Wolfman, we sat in an office together, and then Marv was like, wow, I've got the Bible for Milestone Comics here. I've never seen anything like it. They had done this ginormous Bible about Dakota. It was like a TV show Bible. I don't think anyone had ever done that in comics before. I don't think anyone had done a Bible for the whole world, and they had figured that out.
It's easy to understand why that was the basis of getting Milestone sold to begin with.
Hardware, the first book Milestone published, was about child prodigy Curtis Metcalf. His genius was being exploited by a corrupt businessman, leading him to create an alter ego he used to fight a criminal empire. Hardware was an avatar for the struggles people of color face in corporate America. McDuffie and Cowan reportedly were inspired by their own frustration at the obstacles they faced while at Marvel.
A huge influence on where Dwayne took the first 15 issues of Hardware was Clint Eastwood's movie Unforgiven. We went and saw that, and Dwayne came out and he said, you know what, I think I just figured out Hardware.
Hardware, the whole character feels like semi-autobiographical, you know, like he's a guy who's been a genius and super talented and who's made valuable contributions to the company he works at, but like hits a literal glass ceiling. He's not allowed to partake in ownership and all that stuff, and he gets so mad he becomes a vigilante that strikes out against this mega corporations of various dealings. That felt like probably what people like Dwayne McDuffie and Dennis Cohen and the other founders were going through in their respective careers.
Then there's Static. Teenager Virgil Hawkins was named after a real-life black man who fought for decades for the right to be able to practice law in Florida. In the comics, Virgil gained his electromagnetic powers during the Big Bang incident. He was a comics geek, and his knowledge of science and witty banter led to inevitable comparisons to Peter Parker and Spider-Man. McDuffie and co-writer Robert L. Washington and artist John Paul Leon executed the teen hero concept to perfection.
We were still missing an archetype, and I said, well, we're missing a character like a Spider-Man kind of character. Dwayne spoke about it, and he goes, oh, I got something, I got something. And he starts rattling off this idea about some kid that has these static electric powers, and he's like a little black kid version of Electro that does these different things. And I said, ooh, I got the name. We'll call him Static. Because at the time, James Brown had this hit song out called Static. And the refrain was like, don't start none, won't be none, you know? So I said, let's call him Static.
Static was the Blurred before people were using the term Blurred. He was a black nerd. He was a smart kid. He was not in a gang. He was not running around. He was not in trouble. He'd never been to jail. And these were not images that we were seeing in the media at that time. And you also have to realize, this was like the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s.
Virgil Hawkins' gun violence and the temptation to go out and get a gun to mess with those bullies who've been screwing with you your entire life. That's something Stan Lee in his wildest dreams would never have written. Virgil is a kid who felt so close to the realities of what I think a lot of comic book reading nerds were at the time.
He knew what the character was about, and he was so smart. He really was one of the great storytellers of his time, and he was authentic. He believed in what Static stood for, and he knew that you could have this character that wasn't just a cipher or wasn't just somebody's idea of what the character should be.
I think one of the brilliant things about Static is that Virgil doesn't really become a different person after he gets superpowers. He's the same kid, same corny jokes, same self-doubt and growing pains and whatnot. He just can control electromagnetic energy.
He was exactly the same age as I was. He dressed like I did. He lived in a neighborhood like I did, actually. And it was almost like all of these creators were sort of like siphoning my childhood at the moment. I was like, they have cameras in my house? Like, how is this character like so much like me?
One of the things that always meant so much to me is that superpowers don't solve everything. And I think that's one of the key parts of Static being such a compelling character. You can't just zap all the problems away. You can't just zap away racism or gun violence. You have to think your way through them and talk your way through them.
He understood what it meant to other black kids. He knew how important their representation was, and he wrote it from his heart. And I think that's what made Static so great.
Icon was about an alien being who lands in America during the 1800s and who assimilated the form of a black slave in the South. But it wasn't just a story about Black Superman.
Icon, that was the first character that they dropped. He was actually a cross between Superman and Martian Manhunter because he was an alien and he came here and assumed the form of a black man because he actually had crash landed basically during slavery. And so a black man had saved him and he was not interested in being a superhero.
The great thing about Icon is that he's a character who had these gifts, stifled them for all these years, and he hid them.
He had been here for hundreds of years before Raquel at the time, figured out who he was.
And once this young girl from the hood tries to break into his house on some criminal stuff, she inspires him. It's like, oh wait, I can be a symbol to other people. And
The real kicker was that Rocket got pregnant early on in the run. So this was right out the gate, kicking the door open and helping us realize this was not going to be your ordinary comic book going forward. I can't think of any other comic story among the big two where the sidekick pretty much had her story start with her getting her abilities, and then the rest of the first year was pretty much spent with her trying to balance the fact that she was pregnant and fighting crime with this guy at the exact same time.
That whole storyline was told through her eyes, which was actually not something that you had seen regularly in comics, and I don't think we saw it again until Christopher Priest actually wrote Black Panther. Raquel was the black female character that was leading a comic book series. That hadn't really been done before. Yeah, Storm was there, but she didn't really lead an imprint or have her own comic till much, much later.
she was in the midst of criminal activity when we first meet her. She then rises to become a superhero. And the thing that I loved the most about Milestone Comics was there was tension across generational lines, like Icon trying to lecture the young teenage gangsters of Blood Syndicate, and then be like, yeah, nah, we're not having that.
In 1994, the crossover event Worlds Collide brought the DC and Milestone universes together. Icon issue 16 pitted the Supermen of each world against each other by a being known as Rift. During their battle, Rift details how each hero's path was determined in part by circumstance. Kal-El lands in Kansas, raised by white parents, and becomes a symbol of hope for society. Icon arrives in the Deep South, and because he took the look of an African American, was enslaved. His powers had to be used for simple survival, because he didn't have the benefit of the doubt Metropolis's white Superman had.
One of my favorite comics of all time is Icon number 16. It's the Worlds Collide crossover with Superman, so it's like the Superman family of comics crossed over with the Milestone universe. Superboy meeting Static and other characters like that. Icon number 16 was basically Superman versus Icon. And it's this wonderful parable about what it means to immigrate into American society, what it means to have your contributions valued differently and your worth valued differently.
I was of two minds of it. Like, yes, I was happy to see those two characters finally collide, but at the same time, I kind of enjoyed the fact that Milestone was its own thing and was cultivating its own existence up until that point.
And I mean, that was something that was really huge because it was an aesthetic change, not just in the color of their skin, but how the characters are designed and what inspired them. When you look at characters like Icon, he was designed on a very different palette than Superman. Even though they're comparable in terms of silhouette, there's definitely like African overtones to his costume.
Icon was a character fully fleshed out all its own, and then the crossover happened was a big thing because it helped to shake the stigma of Icon's just a black Superman.
You could feel these creators' frustrations at their careers and how they've been allowed to develop within the comics industry coming through in the books. So that issue of Icon is a great example of that.
Blood Syndicate was, in many ways, Milestone's most radical idea. Co-created by McDuffie and Cowan with writer Ivan Velez Jr., the Syndicate was made up of gang members. Its members included Aquamaria, Holocaust, Tech-9, and Masquerade, one of comics' first transgender characters.
Chris Cross was one of my favorite artists of all time, and I liked the book before them, but when he came on, then it was just like the brakes were off, you know, and it was just like this constant wild ride where you were looking at these kinetic watercolored pages, but with this style that you had never seen in comic books before.
Blood Syndicate, which was like 9, 10 characters deep. I can't even believe there's that many characters. You have to be able to live with these characters. They have to be in your head. And it's kind of weird that you feel like you're talking about them like they're like alive.
All of these characters had this swagger that felt real, even though they had all these fantastic powers. And it's something that inspired the work that I did later on in life, because I really wanted these characters to have a different look and feel than what you're seeing in like the standard sort of like spandex suit, because like who wears that?
Blood Syndicate, man. They were not a group. They were not a, a league. They were a gang. And there were two different gangs that had come together that had both been affected by the same events that affected Static. They were black, white, Latino, gay, straight. There was a trans character. And they were having conversations, and they were saving the lives of people that actually hated them too. There were times that they were like, I know this person like is racist and misogynist and everything, but I'm gonna go ahead and save their lives anyway.
The Milestone writers and artists took full advantage of their creative freedom to tackle issues you simply weren't seeing in the comics being produced in the mid-1990s.
I remember people saying that Milestone copied Image, and no, they just got their stuff out first. Milestone was 1991, they incorporated. They were dealing with DC at the time. Independence was in the air.
And these were creators who have felt repressed in the industry for a long time. This was their actual chance to breathe and do what they wanted with characters that they had created, and that they had stock in, they had equity in, and they wanted to build.
Dwayne McDuff was a details-oriented guy, and him and the rest of the guys wanted to make sure they were putting something out that wasn't out there. They wanted to be able to put it through a voice that we see through our lens. They wanted you to see what it's like when we tell stories. So it wasn't just about some guy putting on a costume and he just happened to be black. This was a guy who had history behind him.
So even though we know now terms like Black Lives Matter and things like that because of things that have happened since, back then they hadn't happened yet. It was just Fight the Power. It was just Public Enemy. It was Wu-Tang. They were putting that language, those people into some of the comics. Rocket, she really wanted to be a writer like Toni Morrison. Like, who was talking about Toni Morrison in comics?
You didn't really see stuff like that through Captain America or Batman or the Titans. And who better to be able to tell about us than the people of color who are creating the material? That was the thing that kind of set them apart from the Marvels and the DCs and the Images.
I think it's very important to know that the people running DC at the time, Paul Levitz and Jeanette Kahn, were really, really committed to trying to be more diverse. And they both really believed in that. And I've heard them talk enough to know that it was so sincere what they believed in, and that doing this really meant a lot to both of them personally, just as a chance to have more African Americans in comics.
If you have given them pretty much editorial carte blanche to do what they want to do, they're going to do what they want to do. Unfortunately, that led to some conflicts with DC, especially near the middle and the end of the Milestone tenure. Guys like Dwayne felt this was our opportunity to actually make a statement about the characters that we're working on. They were going to make that statement. DC editorial be damned or not.
It was almost inevitable that Milestone's envelope pushing would put it at odds with DC. That came to a head with the controversy over the cover to Static issue 25.
It was a cover where the main character, Static, aka Virgil Hawkins, was making out with his girlfriend. It was going to tackle the issues of young people having sex with a candor, but being honest about it. They were going to tackle it because they wanted to bring realism to their characters. The artist also put a condom on the cover, among other paraphernalia.
The original cover, showing two teenagers kissing with condoms laying nearby, did see print on the inside of the comic. But what really stirred the pot was McDuffie's editorial at the end of the issue, where he called out DC and Paul Levitz in particular for interfering with Milestone's editorial decisions.
Vice President of Publishing Paul Levitz over at DC, and he was like, you have to change or edit the cover. Dwayne decided the best thing to do there would be to run the cover because it's truthful and honest to what we're trying to do. So that issue went to press with a letter from Dwayne explaining that the issues that they had with DC about running the cover, in the sake of artistic integrity, they were going to run that cover anyway. And unfortunately, things turned sour with DC from that point on.
That was when everything went to Dwayne was very angry that they were editing that cover, and this is back when you had those Jim Ballant Catwoman covers that were racy. Let's say that. And this was two kids fumbling around on a couch in a partial state of undress with nothing exposed. There's been a lot worse before and since, and Dwayne thought it was arbitrary, and I think he felt that it was due to if not the marketing department at DC, Paul Levitz himself, his discomfort with the idea of depicting black sexuality.
The Milestone guys made a set of decisions because they wanted to get the comics in the widest possible distribution. They really wanted them on every newsstand that we could get them on, not just in the comic shops. There was still a reasonable number of newsstands carrying comics in those years. Well, in order to do that, you had to say, all right, we can do certain things inside the books, but we're not going to get newsstand distribution. They're not going to put the books out if we have certain things on the covers.
Dwayne felt compelled to write an editorial in Static 25 about that, and I think he mentioned Paul by name, and I think he used the word racism somewhere in there, and then suddenly the bills weren't getting paid. Basically, Paul was upset about it, and I think they were squeezing Dwayne out.
That was a case where we got into a dispute about whether that cover could run or how it could run and still accomplish the goal they had set forward.
And for probably 2 weeks, Dwayne wasn't editor-in-chief, Dennis was. Towards the end of that, I quit. Dennis left to go to Motown, and Dwayne was back. But after that, I think Paul felt called out as a racist. And I don't think that's what Dwayne was saying. I think he was trying to make a point about the depiction of black sexuality, but at the same time, that kind of cooled the already rocky relationship by then.
We had some heated conversations on that and other things over the years. That's okay. That's part of the gig.
Dwayne, he was adamant about what he wanted to say. If this was going to be his one opportunity to actually speak truth to power in terms of what those characters were, what they could say, if there was a story element or an issue with certain characters that he felt can't be cut, has to be on there, he was going to fight for it tooth and nail. He was that kind of guy.
By 1997, the tension between Milestone's editorial leaders and DC management would come to a head. The result would be the end of the line for Milestone, but like most things in comics, it wouldn't stay dead for long. Coming up in part 2, we'll examine what led to Milestone's demise, the attempts to revive it, and what the company's ultimate legacy is. Hope you enjoyed this week's Behind the Panel. If you did, hit the subscribe button for more awesome comic book videos. And remember to check out my weekly column at SYFYWIRE.com and listen to the Behind the Panel podcast, an audio documentary series all about comics and the men and women who create them. Be sure to subscribe from wherever you get your podcasts.